Welcome to the Strong Women's Club, episode number 99.
This is the Strong Women's Club, where successful women share their behind-the-scenes stories of how they got to where they are today. Join us.
Hi, everybody. This is Edie Berg. Thank you so much for joining me today. My guest today is Dr. Nora Gold. She's the author of 3 books of fiction, which all have Jewish subject matter as their base. Her first book is called Marrow and Other Stories, and it won a Canadian Jewish Book Award and the Lewis Lockshin Prize for Short Fiction. Alice Munro even sent a short note after having read the title story called Marrow, which said bravo, which is a very big deal. Her second book, entitled Fields of Exile, is all about anti-Israelism on campus, and her second book is called Fields of Exile and is about anti-Israelism on campus, and it won the 2015 Canadian Jewish Literary Award. And her latest novel, The Dead Man, was published in 2016. We talk about that more in the interview coming up. Dr. Gold is also the creator and editor of jewishfiction.net, which is an online literary journal, and it publishes Jewish-themed fiction from all around the world. Today, I speak to Nora a lot about how she chooses her subject matter and how she was able to leave a secure, tenured position as a professor to become an author. Dr. Nora Gold, thank you so much for coming into the Strong Women's Club podcast. What a pleasure to have you here. I just said after a long break, I haven't talked to anybody on the show for about 3 weeks. So it's an honor to have you here with me today.
Oh, it's an honor to be here.
So let's jump right into why you became an author, because you're a doctor, but you're a doctor of social work, and you had a prestigious career in social work, at least in academics, before you became a writer. So what was your career as a social worker, and then how did you choose to become a writer, an author?
Well, actually, I was a writer long before I was a social worker. I wrote even as a child, and when I was in university, I was writing, and I was already publishing stories back then. And my life goal at a certain point was to make Aliyah, and I realized that I would have to support myself, and I got interested in social work, and I was advised by the Aliyah people that it was a good practical profession. Social workers were needed in Israel in 1975, as they still are. So that was the reason for going into social work. And then ultimately I did a doctorate in social work, and I became a professor of social work. But I was always writing. It wasn't a case of first I was a social worker and then I was a writer. I was always a writer first. And at a certain point, I realized that I was going to have to make a choice. I had thought I wouldn't have to make a choice because I was writing while I was a social worker and while I was a student and a professor. And I was writing from 1 to 5 every morning. I had a full-time job. And I realized at the end of that year that there were other people who could teach my social work courses, but there was no one else who could write my books. And for that reason, I decided to resign what was a tenured position. I mean, who gives up a tenured academic position? But I did, and that was 17 years ago, and there's no question it was the right thing to do. I'm very glad I did it.
It's a brave decision to make, although many people, once they make a decision, it doesn't feel brave to them. It's like the thing that they have to do, right? It's like they almost have no choice.
That's very correct. I was really desperate to have the time to write. And I suppose at a certain point, it became obvious to me. I mean, I was writing from 1 to 5 in the morning and then getting up at 7 and going to work. And after a year of that, my health, sometimes your body talks to you. It's not always your mind or your heart. And it became obvious that I was going to have to give up one or the other. And it didn't feel like a hard choice, although it was interesting because I don't know anybody who's given up an academic career in that way. And none of my colleagues did. None of them understood. They all thought there was some other agenda. Was I secretly seeking another university, a more prestigious university, whatever? It was such an odd thing to do in the circles in which I moved. Nobody did that. But I don't know if I felt brave as much as I felt very grateful that I was going to be able to do what I wanted with my life, which is such a privilege. How many people can do that?
So true. Often women, I think, also make a radical change in their careers. It's not just, they decide to take a small, detour, but they make radical changes. I wonder why that is. Why do you think that is? Like, why women have are able to do that, have that kind of fluidity?
I think women who have that fluidity are either in a relationship that can support that or are fortunate in some other way, because of course economics underlie everything. And I was fortunate that I was married, and basically I'm not earning anything except for my books. And that's a joke, which means I'm not earning very much. So the women I know who have done, the kinds of dramatic changes you refer to had some sort of cushion. I mean, there are women who single mothers who have 5 children to support, who do many brave things, but they don't usually leave their only job, So, do I think women are braver than men? I don't know, but I know a lot of women have a sense of desperation in perhaps in a positive sense. A lot of the women I know are feeling that time is very short and life has to be lived as fully as possible and as soon as possible. So I'm not the only one I know who does things like this.
Right. Exactly. Let's talk about your book. Your latest book is called The Dead Man. And I've been listening, as I said to you before we started speaking, I've been listening to you. You have some nice readings online. So I got to know you a little bit and your books also. And they have a connection. This one has a connection to Israel. A strong connection. And you also lived in Israel. So let's talk about that, your connection to Israel and why you came to Israel and why you left Israel and why you like to write about Israel. Many different things. There's a lot there, I know.
Sure. Well, I think for many writers, certainly for myself, you don't necessarily decide what to write about. Something grabs you. And I would say it's something of an unconscious process that, it's a cliche, but it's true that it chooses you. The fact that all 3 of my books have a very strong relationship to Israel is not surprising because I'm deeply love Israel. It's a crucial and central part of my life. Very committed to Israel. As you mentioned, I made Aliyah. And I left really not through a decision to leave. Something personal happened. I came back to study for a year, and something of a personal nature happened during that year that got me stuck here. And several years after that, I met my husband, who I'm very happy to have done. And we are in Israel 3 times a year. We have an apartment there in Jerusalem. I do various kinds of activism and volunteer and political work when I'm there. I'm involved with the Daphne Fund, Karen Daphne.
Sure, I know, Hamut al-Guri.
Yes, exactly. Yes. It's a wonderful board of donor activists and activists, and some of the most exciting Israeli feminists I know are on board with me. It's a great organization. So I have a whole other life in Israel. I feel fortunate. Again, I'm talking about how fortunate I am today, but I feel very fortunate because I have, I don't know, the best of both worlds, but I have a double life. And so inevitably this comes out in my books. My first book, Marrow and Other Stories, is a collection of stories about Jewish women, strong Jewish women. And the title story, which actually Alice Munro loved and wrote me a postcard after reading it.
What an honor.
I know. Bravo. That story is about an experience living through the Intifada. And I won't say more about that, but it's very much about a woman and her body and how she's affected by what happens in an incident that she becomes part of. My second book, Fields of Exile, the first book won a Canadian Jewish Book Award, and the second one won a Canadian Jewish Literary Award in 2015. It was called Fields of Exile, and that was the first novel, and to date the only novel, I believe, about anti-Israelism on campus. And what it's like for not just Canadian, but Jewish students around the world who love Israel and in the case of this book, who are politically progressive and involved with human rights activism, and who perhaps, or perhaps not, naively think that because they have progressive politics, their progressive friends and colleagues will be on side with them in general. And as this student discovers, if you love Israel, then your politics are not good enough. And it was a very difficult book to write, very painful book, but in many ways, I would say an important book. It got a lot of attention from Ruth Weiss, Cynthia Ozick. A lot of people in the Jewish world appreciated dealing with this very difficult topic. And then the third book, the most recent book, which came out last year, The Dead Man, is an exploration of sexism in the arts, among other things. It's about a relationship between a youngish female composer and an older man who is an extremely powerful and prominent ethnomusicologist in the field of Jewish sacred music, which is the kind of music she writes, and he's a music critic. So he has a great deal of power over her career-wise, and then they also fall in love. And it's set in Israel, and in some ways he's a symbol of Israel for the woman as well. So, that becomes a very complicated relationship, and she really becomes obsessed. And that is a novel about music. It's full of music. It's about the power of music and the power of art to heal oneself, among other things. And it's also a book about obsession and passion, and it's a book about Israel. And unlike Fields of Exile or Marrow, which in a sense, both of them were quite political in their references to Israel, in The Dead Man, it's just the setting for the novel. It just takes place in Israel.
I wanted to ask you about that. Now, it's difficult. I would say it would be difficult to write about a woman obsessed about a man while being while she's probably a feminist, right? Although that happens all the time, right? So, how did you deal with that question?
That's an excellent question. It's a wonderful question. I think part of what drew me to write this story was I woke up in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep one night, and I came across a movie on TV. I came in the middle, and I didn't know what it was called at the time, but it's called Play Misty for Me. And whenever I do book talks, there are always people in it who know. It's a movie produced and starred in by Clint Eastwood in the 1970s, and it's about a woman he's a disc jockey, and this teeny bopper falls in love with him and becomes a stalker. And I looked at this woman, and I remember thinking, what does she think this man can give her? What does she think his love or admiration can really do for her? And I'd never been interested in obsession, but I actually thought this is really fascinating. And the more I thought about it, I realized that, the obsession and love and all of these things are really matters of the heart. And they're completely separate from ideology and from the mind. And I thought it would be fascinating to make this character a feminist whose mind and heart are at war. And among other things, on top of the fact that she's obsessed, and she's a music therapist as well as a composer, so she tries to heal herself and she can't. Physician, heal thyself, and she can't. On top of everything else, she finds it really embarrassing as a feminist. How can this be? I'm not someone who built my life around a man. I have contempt for women like that. And here I am dying for this man to love me, So it's really a feminist reflection. And it's interesting how much this book has resonated with women from all backgrounds, traditional women, because I've given talks to book clubs with women from very traditional backgrounds, Jewish and not Jewish. But feminists really understand this book too, because ultimately the heart doesn't know ideology. It doesn't understand ideology.
Right. And there's always that kind of a contrast, or nothing is very clear cut is what I'm trying to say. It's everything has kind of fuzzy edges. Everything is very clear until it isn't. So, right. So
exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. At all ages, even when you become wise and old, it stays
very
the same.
When I talk about this book, so far there have been 4 women who have come up to me, all over the age of 80, who confided in me with great embarrassment but gratitude that they have fallen in love recently. They are in love, and it's unrequited love. and they can't eat and they can't sleep. And also, I happen to know these women, and they're intellectual women and they're feminist women, and they're laughing at themselves and they're utterly helpless. And
that's
and
wonderful.
I laugh
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is wonderful. What kind of a family did you come from? Your subject matter and you yourself are very Zionistic, or maybe, I guess. I don't know. Maybe that's a hard word to say, but sometimes. But you're involved with Israel. What kind of a background do you come from?
I don't come from a Zionist home. My father was a Yiddishist, and so the only formal Jewish education I received as a child was Yiddish, which I can read and understand well. My spoken Yiddish isn't great, but I love Yiddish, and actually we'll talk afterwards perhaps about this literary journal that I published, but I always make sure to include some Yiddish if I can. I discovered Israel myself through a summer camp. And, there's all this research lately on the power of summer camp for Jewish identity, for all sorts of things, but specifically in terms of Jewish identity. I ended up, by a fluke, going to a camp called Kisufim in 1964 when I was 12. Because my cousin's boyfriend was trying to drum up business for this camp. It was Habonim Dror.
Oh, I went to Habonim Dror too.
Yeah. I never got into the youth movement, but I had two months of that summer camp, which was also indoctrinated us, and they were open about that, about socialism. And we had capitalist day at camp, in which I was the only kid in my bunk who was given meals because they paired us up. They assigned us our class by our parents, and my father was a lawyer and then a judge. And the kids in my bunk had parents who were shopkeepers, and they didn't get to eat, and I had food. And it was a profoundly affecting experience. So this was a very intense camp ideologically, and I came out at the end of the summer really feeling that Israel was my home and that's where I should be. And when I was 12, and that basically never left me. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
So
my home was very
intellectual. Not an intellectual, but not a religious home.
It wasn't a religious home. When I was 15, I became religious myself. I went to a family bar mitzvah and I encountered Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, for the first time, and I became religious. And I'm still traditional. I'm not Orthodox at present, but Judaism became a huge part of my life when I was 15. And that dovetailed, of course, with my desire to be in Israel because I wanted to live a life as a complete Jew, as I thought of it, and not as a partial Jew. And so all of these things kicked in together. And
what did your family think when you became suddenly religious?
That's exactly where I was going to go next. I mean, it was very strange for them. It was alienating, to say the least. And also when I was kosher, of course, I wouldn't eat in their home and I'd bring my own dishes. And this did not go over well. But I moved out when I was 17 anyway. And then I made Aliyah when I was 22. And my father actually came to visit me when I lived there. And of course, they accepted it. Not that they had a great deal of choice. But yeah, I think there's room in families for different ideologies and for different approaches. And my family certainly is a Jewish home, not at all religious, but my father was very proud of being Jewish, and my mother is Jewish and all that. But yeah, I'm different from the rest of my family in my approach and beliefs. Although my brothers have Jewish homes too, for sure.
Okay, let's talk about jewishfiction.net, which is your publication, your online. You publish fiction works of Jewish authors, quite well-known Jewish authors, as well as lesser-known authors, I assume. Mm-hmm. Why did you start that? Why did you feel the need to start that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in 2010, I became aware, as I had in a couple of years leading up to that the digital revolution was not in equal sense affecting Jewish writers as all writers. I mean, as you know, as everyone knows, the advent of digital publishing caused a revolution in print publishing, and it became very difficult to find publishers for everybody. The whole game changed, as we know. But I began to notice that many Jewish writers I knew were having a particularly difficult time because Jewish fiction is considered niche fiction. I'm not talking about a love story between two New York Jews, Susie and Michael, and they happen to be Jewish. That's mainstream fiction. But anything that deals with Jewish themed work, we're talking historically, Zionism, Holocaust, theological, identity issues, anything at all that isn't absolutely universal except for the fact that the characters are Jewish, has a very hard time. And I saw a real need for something. And ever the social worker, of course, you see a need and you think about how that can be addressed. So I started a literary journal called jewishfiction.net, which is free and online, and anybody can access all the stories. We have now published fiction from all around the world, from 5 continents, either written in English or translated into English. We've published stories or novel excerpts from 14 languages: Italian, Hungarian, English, French, Spanish, Russian, Romanian, Serbian, Turkish, Polish, Croatian, Hebrew, Ladino, and Yiddish. We have readers in over 140 countries, so it's become a huge thing. We've now published, over 300 works. We're in huge demand. And it's a joy to be able to help and support other writers. There's really nothing like it. It is the only English language journal in the world, in print or online, devoted exclusively to Jewish fiction. And I think of it as a way of providing a space for all Jews of all different backgrounds, ideologies, beliefs, ethnicities, classes, sexual orientations, to share. And half of every issue is women writers, which would not naturally happen for a variety of reasons. So it's in many ways a proactive and kind of social literary journal. But we only accept absolutely first-rate work. And we've, of course, we're very honored. We've published Elie Wiesel, Aaron Appelfeld, Aleph Beit Yoshua, Nava Semmel, Savion Liebrecht, Chava Rosenfarb, wonderful, very famous writers. But the real goal is to make space for wonderful emerging writers. And I'd encourage any of your listeners, all of your listeners, to check it out. Actually, if you Google Jewish fiction, we usually come up first. And also, it's very important to us that it's free. I had a fantasy when my son was in high school of all of his friends on the bus coming home, just reading a story instead of, playing a computer game. And
that
some
is
of
a
them,
fantasy.
some younger people do read. In fact, the journal is written by people of all ages. It is a free journal, which means that I fundraise periodically. And we have a volunteer team of 8 people. Everything goes through blind review. So it's a serious literary journal. Always looking for donations, but it's a real joy. And we have been acknowledged and praised all around the world. We've been written up in numerous magazines such as The Forward, The Jewish Week. Everybody writes about us and knows about us, and it's a wonderful thing.
Great. So how much of your novels, I'm always curious about this in fiction novels, but how much of your novels is autobiographical? How much do you put of yourself into the books?
Well, I think since novels, fiction of any kind, comes from one's innermost self, inevitably there are parallels, they're expressions of one's lives. If I have a character who loves Israel, that's an obvious reflection of me. If I have a character who's a feminist, that coincides well with my own beliefs, though not all of my characters obviously are feminists or female or anything. They're not autobiographical in the sense that if you substituted the pronoun she with the pronoun I, and I read it to you, it would all be a lie. I mean, those things happen to me. Now, that said, in Fields of Exile, for example, it's entirely a fictional character, but there's nothing that happens in terms of anti-Israelism on campus. There is not one thing that happens to that character that did not happen in real life to somebody, including the kinds of demonstrations, the aggressions, the kinds of placards that people carried. the kinds of lies that were told about Israel, the etc., all of the things that go on, including the physical violence and the verbal violence. So nothing there was invented, but none of that ever happened to me. So it's not autobiographical.
No. So, okay. So my last question is going to be about your process.
Yeah, sure.
And how you start. How do you finished your last book, you've done your book tour, you've finished it, you're ready for the next one. What is your process? How do you start? And once you start, what does your day-to-day look like, your routine?
Mm-hmm. Well, to return to that theme of what I pick versus what picks me, I always have a pad by my bed, and I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning. And after I've filled a bunch of these pads, it's pretty clear that there's something that's grabbed me in the stomach. Something that is extremely compelling for me for whatever reason. And I usually don't know the reason. And in fact, the title story of the book Marrow, which I wrote in an hour and a half, start to finish, and then I spent 10 minutes editing it the next day, and that was it. I didn't understand until 5 years later what that story was really about, and it's not what it seems to be about. So that, the relationship of the unknown and the known and the unconscious and the conscious is very complicated. But when you're writing, you're just writing. The editing process is a completely different thing, and one of the first things you learn as a writer is that you don't mix the two. You don't write a paragraph or a sentence and start editing it, as you know, as you do writing too. So my process is that I just let it flow. And when I see what it's about, sometimes I'll think, well, I don't want to write about that. That's painful territory. That's self-revealing territory. That's difficult territory. And inevitably I decide to stay with it, because that's where the mother lode is, to use that word. That's where the gold, the deposit of gold, no pun intended, is located in the mine shaft. And that's where you've got to go. So the process is, theoretically, I spend my mornings, which is my best time, the first part of the day, the best cut of the day for me on my writing. But because I was brought up to think, work before play, and I always think about writing as play, whether I should or not, things like jewishfiction.net, tend to be the first thing I do, just answering a couple of emails. And lately I've noticed that, by the time I finished my emails, it's 11 in the morning, and that's really a problem. So I'm actually shifting around my schedule very consciously and not turning on email first thing in the morning. This morning I got up at 5 and I started writing at 5. So that's really a very clear priority. I also have done activism. I co-founded 3 progressive Zionist organizations in Canada and was extremely involved in all of them up until not that long ago, when I said I really have to prioritize my own writing, and secondarily my journal, and of course family and friends and life in Israel, which those don't come third, fourth, fifth, sixth. They
Sure, it's all mixed up.
So that's really what an average day looks like for me. And then I always stop for lunch and go for a walk or meet a friend or something, and then I try to take another hour or hour and a half around 4:35 before supper. And recently a friend told me actually that he was a student at Oxford, and that is the required schedule, that there's something about coming back to your work later in the day after some physical exercise or social contact that is very, very important. And I find the insights I get in the late afternoon are very different than the ones I get in the morning. It's very mysterious, this whole process.
It's very interesting. Really. Yeah. Yeah, very, yes. And wonderful. When you say it that way, when I think about my work, when I work, usually I have most of my energy in the mornings, and I'm very gung-ho, but I can concentrate the best late at night, like late. And even if I know I should be going to sleep and I should be, and I'm worried about the next day, what's going to happen. As you said, these things, you can't always define them.
No, and everybody has a different personal rhythm. And I guess, if you're conscious about life and the value of time, you think about when you're at your best and you give that to what's most important to you. And I have a friend who recently told me that she comes home from work and she's exhausted and irritable, and that's when she has time with her kids. And it's, she's beginning to question, not that it's ever easy because you work and that's when you come home, but, what possible creative solutions there could be for giving a better part of herself to her family.
Well, that's a good way to advocate for being an entrepreneur or
absolutely
right, self-employed, which is really the best for me.
It is.
Okay, so people can find you at noragold.com, and your publication is jewishfiction.net, all one word, jewishfiction.net. Anything else, any place else I should send people to? Where can they buy your books?
My books are online everywhere. Amazon, for sure. They're in bookstores everywhere. The first one is Marrow and Other Stories. The second is Fields of Exile. And the third is The Dead Man.
Perfect. So, Dr. Nora Gold, thank you so much for coming on to the Strong Women's Club podcast. It's a true pleasure to meet you and talk to you.
Thank you, Edie. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Nora Gold. Next week, we will be at episode number 100. So I'm going to be doing something special for that episode. So remember to please tune in. If you don't want to have to remember the exact time to get that special episode, then the easiest thing to do is to just subscribe to the podcast and you'll get the episodes automatically. You only have to do that one time. You just go over to iTunes or wherever you happen to get your podcasts, click on the subscribe button for the Strong Women's Club podcast, and that's it. Then you'll get the new episodes automatically, and you'll be able to hear the older interviews also, of which there really are a lot by now. 100 is actually more than 100 because I've done little mini episodes as well. So we're actually up to 126 or 127 already. And I know you're going to find something there or somebody there that I spoke to in the past that you'd like to hear about their backstory or their behind-the-scenes background of their current work. And you'll be able to have that here on the Strong Women's Club podcast. So go over, please, and subscribe. Another nice thing for you to do that will really help to grow the show, which helps me a lot, is to share the podcast. Share your favorite episode with a friend or two friends. You can even just copy that subscribe link and send it to them, like in a WhatsApp message or an SMS. So it's as easy as can be for them also. And they'll thank you for it. People are always looking for interesting, free things to listen to while they go about their days. And this podcast could very well be something that they'd like. And I'd really greatly appreciate it. So have a great day, everybody. I'm going to talk to you next week. Litrot.